I still remember the weight of that suitcase in my hand, how the leather handle pressed grooves into my palm, as I stood in the doorway of what had been our bedroom for 23 years. It wasn't heavy with belongings, you understand, just the essentials, things I could carry on my own. Everything else, the furniture we'd chosen together, the photographs in silver frames, the china we'd received as wedding gifts, all of it stayed behind like artifacts of a life I was willingly abandoning. Robert was at work, of course, at that downtown firm where he spent more time than he ever spent with me, and I had timed my departure with the precision of a woman who had been planning her escape for longer than she cared to admit. The afternoon light came through the curtains in dusty streams, and I took one last look at the bed where we'd made love, argued, dreamed, and slowly grown into strangers sleeping back to back in the darkness. I was 51 years old that day, and everyone told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. My mother called me foolish, said women our age don't just walk away from stability, from a husband with a good job and a respectable name. My sister practically begged me to reconsider, asked what I would do, where I would go, how I would survive on a secretary's salary in a world that wasn't kind to middle-aged women starting over. But they didn't know, couldn't know what those 23 years had cost me. They saw the house with its manicured lawn, the vacation photos from our trips to places where Robert spent more time on business calls than with me. The Christmas cards with our smiling faces that lied about the happiness inside. They didn't see the small deaths that happen in a marriage, when one person takes and takes while the other slowly empties themselves out like a vessel with no bottom. Robert and I met when I was 26, which back then was considered almost too late, dangerously close to becoming a permanent spinster. He was handsome in that clean, cut, ambitious way that makes mothers approve and daughters swoon. He worked for his father's law firm and had plans, big plans, he told me on our third date, plans that involved corner offices and vacation homes and a life of comfort. I was teaching elementary school then. Loved the smell of chalk dust and the sound of children's laughter, the way their faces lit up when they finally understood something I'd been trying to explain. But Robert said teaching was noble, sure, but we'd need more than a teacher's salary to build the life he envisioned for us. So I became a secretary at his father's firm, answering phones and typing letters, making coffee for men who earned 5 times what I did for half the work. The first few years were good, or at least I remember them that way, though memory has a way of softening the edges of things. We had a small apartment near the park, and on Sundays, we'd walk hand in hand under the elm trees and talk about the future, about the children we'd have, 3 of them. Robert wanted 2 boys and a girl. I wanted to name them after my grandparents, old-fashioned names that carried history, but Robert preferred modern names, successful names, he called them. Looking back now, I can see how even then, even in those honeymoon years, my wants were always negotiable while his were carved in stone. We tried for children for 7 years. 7 long years of hope and disappointment, of doctor's appointments and treatments that left me feeling like a broken machine being examined for defects. The doctors said there was no reason, no medical explanation, sometimes these things just don't happen. But Robert's mother had a different theory, mentioned casually over Sunday dinner that perhaps I was being punished, that perhaps I had some sin I needed to confess. I still remember the taste of pot roast turning to ash in my mouth, the way Robert said nothing, just kept cutting his meat into precise little squares like his mother hadn't just implied I was cursed. When I was 35, we stopped trying. Robert said it was probably for the best. That children were expensive and time-consuming, and he was up for partner soon, needed to focus on his career. I nodded and agreed because that's what I'd learned to do, swallow my grief and disappointment like bitter medicine, smile and agree and pretend that my dreams dying was just a natural part of growing up. I threw myself into my work, volunteered at the church, kept the house spotless, cooked elaborate dinners that Robert often missed because of late meetings. I became very good at being alone while married. The affairs started, or at least I became aware of them, when I was 42. Little things at first, lipstick on a collar that wasn't my shade, receipts from restaurants we'd never been to together, a new cologne that smelled like someone else's choice. I confronted him once, just once, laid the evidence on the kitchen table like a prosecutor presenting a case. He laughed, actually laughed, and told me I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination run wild because I was bored and lonely, and looking for drama where there wasn't any. He was so convincing, so absolutely certain, that I almost believed him. Almost. But women know. We always know. We just sometimes choose not to know because knowing means having to do something about it. I stayed for 9 more years after that first affair. 9 years of pretending, of attending his work functions and smiling at the women I suspected, of sleeping in the same bed with a man who was rarely really there. I stayed because I was afraid, because starting over at 42 seemed impossible, because I'd invested so much time and heart into this marriage that walking away would mean admitting it was all for nothing. I stayed because it was easier than leaving, because my mother's voice in my head kept saying, "You made your bed, now lie in it." Because society tells women that a bad marriage is still better than no marriage at all. But something shifted in me the summer I turned 50. We were at another company dinner, one of those insufferable affairs where everyone pretends to enjoy rubber chicken and weak wine while networking and gossiping. Robert's latest secretary was there, a girl named Jennifer who couldn't have been more than 25, all blonde hair and bright eyes and that specific kind of young woman confidence that comes from being pretty and not yet knowing how the world will use that against her. I watched Robert watch her all evening. Saw the way his hand lingered on her shoulder when he introduced her around, noticed how he laughed at her jokes, with a warmth I hadn't directed at me in years. And suddenly, sitting there in my navy dress that Robert had picked out because it was appropriate and professional, I realized I didn't care, not the way I used to, not with that knife twist of jealousy and hurt that had become so familiar. I looked at Robert, really looked at him, and saw a man I didn't love anymore, maybe didn't even like. He'd become a stranger wearing a familiar face, someone whose dreams I'd confused with my own, whose approval I'd been chasing for so long I'd forgotten why I wanted it in the first place. The realization didn't come with fireworks or dramatic revelation, it came quiet and sure, like winter settling in, inevitable and unstoppable. I started planning that night. Opened a separate bank account the following week with money I'd been secretly saving from my paychecks, just a little here and there that Robert never noticed, because he'd long stopped paying attention to anything I did. I found a small apartment across town, nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom with good light and hardwood floors that creaked in a homey way. I made lists, practical lists about what I needed to take, what I could leave behind, how to disentangle a life so thoroughly braided with another's. I moved like a spy in my own house, careful and calculated, because I absolutely knew, that if Robert suspected I was leaving, he would find a way to stop me. Not because he loved me, but because he needed me, needed the image of stability I provided, the respectable wife who managed his household, and made him look good at company functions. The final straw, the moment that transformed planning into action, came on a random Tuesday evening in late September. Robert came home late again, smelling of wine and perfume, and I was reading in the living room, some novel about a woman who'd sailed around the world alone. He looked at me sitting there in the lamplight, and I saw something flicker across his face, contempt maybe, or boredom, or just that casual cruelty that comes from taking someone for granted for too long. He said, without preamble, without any pretense of kindness, "You know, Margaret, you've really let yourself go. Maybe if you made more of an effort, I'd want to come home earlier." I closed my book slowly, marked my place with care, and looked up at this man I'd given the best years of my life to. And I said, calm as still water, "You're absolutely right, Robert. I have let myself go. I've let go of the girl who thought you hung the moon. I've let go of the woman who believed your lies. And tomorrow, I'm letting go of this marriage." The expression on his face was almost worth the 23 years of unhappiness, shock, then disbelief, then that particular kind of anger men feel when women stop playing by the unspoken rules. He stammered something about being hasty, about talking things through, about how we could work on things if I was unhappy, and I realized then that he truly believed I would break down, would cry and beg and negotiate my worth like I'd done so many times before. He thought I would wait for him to change, to become the man I'd needed him to be all along. He had no idea I'd already moved beyond waiting, beyond hoping, beyond any future that included him. I left the next afternoon while he was at work, took that single suitcase, and walked out the door without looking back. I didn't leave a note, because what was there left to say that hadn't already been said in 1,000 small silences? In all those nights I'd cried quietly in the bathroom so he wouldn't hear, in every dream I'd deferred, and every piece of myself I'd sacrificed on the altar of our marriage. My wedding ring I left on the kitchen counter, gold band gleaming in the afternoon light, a small circle of metal that had promised forever, but delivered something far less. The divorce took 8 months. 8 months of lawyers and mediations and Robert acting wounded, playing the victim, telling anyone who would listen that I'd abandoned him without warning, that I was going through some kind of middle-aged crisis, that he'd been blindsided. His family rallied around him, of course, told me I was being selfish, that I'd regret this decision, that women my age don't get second chances. But I didn't want a second chance at the life I'd been living. I wanted something new, something mine. Something that didn't require me to shrink myself down to fit into someone else's vision of what I should be. I went back to teaching, found a position at a small elementary school in a neighborhood where the houses were modest, and the parents worked 2 jobs, but showed up for every recital and parent-teacher conference. The salary was less than half what I'd made as a secretary, but I didn't care. I loved being back in a classroom, loved the smell of crayons and paste, loved the way 7-year-olds tell the truth with such absolute certainty, loved feeling useful in a way that mattered. I rented that little apartment I'd found, furnished it with thrift store finds and plants that I actually managed to keep alive, painted the bedroom walls a soft yellow that reminded me of morning light. Robert remarried within 2 years, married Jennifer, that young secretary with the bright eyes, had a big wedding that made the society pages. My mother called to tell me, couldn't help herself, wanted to know what I'd given up, what I'd lost. But I felt nothing, not even the satisfaction of being proved right about the affair, just a distant kind of pity for a girl who would learn the same lessons I had. Though maybe faster, maybe with less of herself left at the end. I dated occasionally, nothing serious, just dinners and movies with men who were kind but ultimately not right, or sometimes right but not right for me. I learned to be alone without being lonely, learned the difference between solitude and isolation, between independence and loneliness. I took watercolor classes at the community center, painted terrible landscapes that I hung on my walls anyway because they were mine, proof that I was still capable of creating something, even if imperfectly. I traveled, small trips to places I'd always wanted to see, stood in front of paintings in museums without anyone rushing me along, ate dinner at whatever time I wanted, stayed up late reading without anyone complaining about the light. The years passed, gentle and quiet, and I discovered something extraordinary. I liked myself. Not the woman I'd been with Robert, that diminished, apologetic version always trying to anticipate his needs and avoid his disappointments. But this new woman, this woman who wore what she wanted and said what she thought and didn't apologize for taking up space in the world. I liked her. More than that, I loved her. This late, blooming version of myself that had been waiting all along underneath layers of should and must and have to. I heard about Robert occasionally, through mutual acquaintances who didn't know better than to mention him. The marriage to Jennifer lasted 5 years before she left him. Rumor had it for the same reasons I had. Though she was smart enough to leave while she was still young enough to start over completely. He married again, a 3rd time, to a woman whose name I never bothered to remember. The law firm his father built folded during the recession, something about bad investments and worse decisions, and Robert ended up at some smaller firm, no longer the golden boy with the corner office and the big plans. I retired from teaching at 68, had a party in the school cafeteria where former students, some now with children of their own, came back to say goodbye and thank you and tell stories about how I'd made a difference. That was my legacy, not a house in the suburbs or a last name attached to a respectable family, but the lives I'd touched, the children I'd helped see themselves as capable and worthy and full of possibility. That night, Lying in my bed in my small apartment with its yellow walls and thriving plants, I cried. But they were good tears, grateful tears, tears that tasted like peace. I'm 76 now, living in a senior community that's not quite a nursing home, but not quite independent either. That in-between place where you're still yourself but with help nearby if you need it. I have a small garden plot where I grow tomatoes and basil, have friends who play cards on Tuesday nights and go to the movies on Fridays, have a routine that's mine and only mine. My health is good enough, some arthritis, blood pressure medication, the usual indignities of aging, but my mind is sharp and my heart is light. Robert died last spring. His obituary was in the paper, survived by his third wife and no children, services private, donations to the law school scholarship fund in lieu of flowers. I read it twice, waiting to feel something, grief or satisfaction or closure, but there was nothing, just that same distant neutrality I'd felt for decades. He'd become irrelevant to my life so long ago that even his death couldn't touch me. I didn't go to the funeral, didn't send flowers or condolences. Because I'd said my goodbye to him that September afternoon when I walked out with my single suitcase. Sometimes at night, when the apartment is quiet and I'm sitting in my chair with a book and a cup of tea, I think about that woman I was, 51 and terrified and brave enough to leave anyway. I think about how she thought she was walking away from her life, but really she was walking toward it. Toward all the years of peace and purpose and self-respect that were waiting. I think about how close I came to staying, how easily I could have convinced myself that endurance was the same thing as courage, that staying in a bad marriage was somehow more noble than leaving it. And I think about all the women who are still there, still in those marriages that diminish them, still waiting for their husbands to change, still believing that love means sacrificing yourself on someone else's altar. If I could speak to them, those women sitting in houses that don't feel like homes, I would tell them this: you are not too old, it is not too late. The life you want is still possible, but only if you're brave enough to walk toward it. And yes, people will judge you, will call you selfish and foolish, and every other name that women who choose themselves get called. But their judgment will fade, while your freedom will grow, will bloom, will become the thing you're most grateful for when you're old and looking back on the choices you made. The strangest thing about leaving Robert wasn't the leaving itself, but discovering that I'd been mourning our marriage for years before I actually left it. By the time I walked out that door, I'd already grieved what we'd never been, and would never be. The divorce papers were just paperwork, a legal formality confirming what had been true in my heart for longer than I wanted to admit. He thought I would break down, thought I would beg him to stay, thought I would wait forever for him to become someone he was never going to be. But I was already gone, had been leaving in small ways for years, one disappointment at a time, one broken promise at a time, one night sleeping alone beside him at a time. The physical leaving was just the final step in a journey that had started long before. Now, in these last good years, I measure wealth differently than I once did, not in houses or bank accounts or last names that open doors, but in mornings when I wake up without dread, in friendships built on truth rather than appearances, in the quiet satisfaction of a life lived on my own terms. I am not rich in the way the world counts riches, but I am free, and freedom, I have learned, is worth more than any comfort that comes at the cost of yourself. The girl I was at 26 would not recognize this old woman I've become, but I think she would like her. I think she would be proud. And that, more than anything else, is the inheritance I'm leaving behind, not to children I never had, but to any woman who needs to know that it's never too late to choose yourself, to walk away from the life that's killing you and toward the one that will let you breathe.